So I'm going to try not to use PowerPoint, but there are a few visuals. So I'm Joe Schilling. I am a Senior Policy Associate at the Urban Institute, but I am also an alum of the GW Masters in Environmental Law program, and I teach adjunct in law school, and also in the Sustainability Urban Planning program at GW. So as I was explaining to Donna, who's part of the reason why I'm here, is in the fall I'm teaching future lawyers how to think like planners, policymakers, local government officials. And now in the spring I'm teaching planners or future planners how lawyers and judges think. So I get to, in my own sort of duality, apply that in my teaching as well. So we're going to talk a little bit about scenario planning, but before we do that, I kind of want to go around the room because, you guys have been here all day, you've heard a lot of great presentations, but if you just introduce yourself and, maybe if you had to make a decision between this and two other ones. So I'm just curious, like, why did you decide this one? So introduce yourself and, sort of.
So, hello everyone, Deborah Johnson. I'm basically here because I'm one of the contributors to the work that Ira's been talking about. And my work is really very much involved in the intersection of sustainability and disaster prevention.
Okay.
So scenario planning.
Scenario planning is familiar territory.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
I'll start here because I'm taking notes for you, but.
Oh, okay.
No, but
well, I appreciate that.
I'm also interested in this topic because one, I've been working in climate for most of my career. That's very focused on scenario development, especially for planning and decision making. And then I've recently become very interested in how we can combine visual and analytic tools to help make decisions kind of in a real time, turn the knobs of the world kind of way. Simulations of the world.
Got it.
I'm Jennifer Bradley. I'm a senior fellow with the Presby Foundation. Presby's based in Greater Detroit, and we care about increasing equity. So, unlike the previous speakers, I'm not here for the scenario planning. I'm here for equitable and climate resilient legislation. Because that's what Presby does, and I've known Joe.
Well, probably when I first started
A significant
here,
double-digit number of years, and we asked him to be here.
Peter Soika, I'm part of the infamous core group. I've been working with Ira Feldman on various and sundry activities for 5 years. Operate an independent sustainability management consulting firm. Believer in scenario planning out of analytical tools, providing services and clarity. So this is just a combination of topics that we're hearing about.
My name is Paul Freixelli. I am with EPA, Office of Policy, and I chose this session because I think it's going to be more than
I feel pressure already.
Julia Pascal. I'm a contractor with FEMA right now. I don't know much about planning, but I find it very interesting.
I'm Donna Tomasio. As you probably heard earlier, I'm the managing director for the GW Alliance for Sustainable Future. So when we think about future, scenario planning becomes a very significant part about where are we going, and because you have to know where you're going before you can get there. I'm also a crossover between this program and the other program that Joe teaches in. I was the former assistant dean for energy law here. My background, my expertise is actually in energy law. But I also am very interested in urban planning and how we develop cities. And I actually was a student in the Sustainable Urban Planning program. And actually, that's made with Needy, so she's actually down the other. I told her I'd take minutes for her.
Hi everyone, I'm Marissa Canonal. In my master's in law school work as a student, I was focused on what sort of the policy, legal, and equity and But I recently came out of the administration, or previous administration, working at the Department of the Interior, mostly on energy issues. So I'm sort of in that policy framework kind of mind, and appreciate that equity focus. So that's why I'm here.
Hi, my name is Hannah. I'm currently a Duke student, Master of Global Health, so Global Health Epidemiology, kind of climate epi. But before that, my second career, I was a disaster response manager and planner, and humanitarian response manager and planner. And so, to me, this is really the meeting of the worlds, and kind of the exciting why I got into epi in the first place is to be able to have conversations like this in a data-informed place, and this is cool. It's exciting.
All right, epi. I haven't heard that shortcut or that abbreviation in a while. So, okay, so unlike what I would say the amazing job of all the previous speakers who have helped frame this issue of climate migration, or as I've been now learning to say, talking about climate mobility as opposed to migration, and focusing on receiving cities. This is brand new territory, right? We don't really know much about it. We don't know when it's going to happen, where it's going to happen, how it's going to be happening. There's a lot of uncertainty. This convening is great because all of us here and at this workshop, we're really interested. Some are already working in this space, but it's very nascent. And I set that stage because then it becomes, well, what do we do? Right? We've got this really, I mean, I'm not even sure it's an elephant in the room. It's a damn herd of elephants in this room, and we have to figure out what to do. And I'd say the place to start is to do scenario planning. But scenario planning as a well-tested process is ideal to deal with issues where there's a lot of uncertainty. And so what could be more uncertain than what we're going to do with climate migration in receiving cities? So I'm not sure we'll get to all these part threes, and I would say at any time, interrupt if you've got an observation, you have an example, you have a question. So our hope is that we'll kind of quickly ground you in what is scenario planning and why it's ideal for climate mobilities. We'll use as our kind of case study almost 2 years ago, thanks to the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy and my partners at the Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative, which is Kent State. We held a half-day scenario planning workshop. It was really like a pilot, convened by the Sustainability Coordinator for Cuyahoga County. We brought in Cleveland Foundation, a whole bunch of different cross-sector stakeholders, and walked them through a scenario plan for Cleveland as a Great Lakes receiving city. And we learned a lot about Cleveland, about how this process could be adapted. But I would say this was, not to have a pun, but it's just like we're just like dipping our toes into the water. What you really would need is a much more robust process. But I think the questions for you all is, if we're talking about moving a lot of the ideas that you've heard here into action, then how could policymakers, be at a variety of scales and levels, how could communities apply scenario planning? And then for you all, individually, through your organizations and networks, how could you use scenario planning to really begin what has to be a very difficult, confusing conversation? I mean, if you went to, even in a receiving city like Duluth, and you advertise and said, hey, we're going to have free lunch. Spend a day and we're going to talk about, the impending climate migration that is coming your way. I don't know, how many people would show up, right? So it's still in, so what's scenario planning? The go-to organization for scenario planning is the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in Cambridge. People generally familiar with Lincoln. It's probably a longer story, but for a variety of reasons, they have developed essentially a practice around scenario planning. There are conferences. I think they just had one in January in Arizona. The backstory is, you know, the Lincoln Institute was endowed by the Lincoln Electrical Company that was in Cleveland, but then they moved to Cambridge because they got excited about the tax problem with Paul. Well, anyway, so and now, but the family left Cleveland and they're in Arizona, so they now have these nice winter conferences in Arizona. But you can get a certificate in scenario planning. You can attend workshops, but this gives you the basic typology, right? Is that most of the time when we're doing, you know, normative scenario planning is like, okay, we already sort of know what we're dealing with. We're trying to weigh community values. So you're kind of trying to balance competing interests and you're trying to reach direction. So this could be around a particular project. So think of it like at that level. Predictive scenario planning, that might be some of the scenario planning that a few of you thinking about analytics might be interested, where you're trying to forecast the future and you're using a lot of data and analytics to sort of, let's figure out what that future might look like. So that could also, I mean, in some ways, predictive scenario planning happens when you're doing market analysis and trying to figure out where, you know, trends are going to go. But exploratory scenario planning, XSP, sounds like some kind of spaceship. Here you've got multiple possible futures. Some are desirable and some are not. And so you're really grappling with something that is complex, uncertain, as they say, a wicked problem, and you're trying to at least kind of understand what the alternatives are. And of course, you want to do this in an objective way. You have metrics, you try to prepare contingency plans, and the challenge, of course, is trying to adapt to these factors that are always changing. We heard in that lunchtime, people were saying, well, you know, the poor folks in North Carolina, Asheville, that was a climate haven up until, you know, 8 months ago. So, you know, even places that seem to be safe have issues.
But again, that whole idea of even saying that Asheville was a climate haven is kind of built on a faulty premise, and that is,
Oh, yeah.
right? That there's been any definition, really, of what a climate haven needs to do.
Well, and I would say, sort of fast forwarding, is there were many inescapable conclusions when we did this scenario planning workshop in Cleveland. One that was presented by the researchers, the scientists that helped set the stage for us is that no place is safe from climate change. There will be different levels of, different types of climate impacts and different scales. So when, to your point, when any of the Great Lakes cities say that they are a climate haven, that's very, yeah, that's either one misnomer, it's very different to say that, oh, this is a climate safe space, because Cleveland, well, even Buffalo, right? There was, maybe not this winter, but the winter before last, they had the killer, you know, snowstorm. And it was just around Buffalo and, you know, in its proximity. Cleveland didn't get that, so. Yes, you had a question, or?
I was just going to say that that situation just points out the danger of trying to make things more understandable by aggregating into a simple overall average or something like that. And you might have one indicator that is sort of way to one side of the distribution. And Asheville is a good example.
Yeah, So, so here is a resource written by, again, my colleagues Terry Schwartz, Nick Reykjavik, who's a professor of environmental science and planning at the University at Buffalo. And so they developed a guide, scenario planning for climate in migration at the time, 2.5 years ago. And what you'll see is that you identify various scenarios and you create a narrative around that. So one is this way, crisis-driven growth. So this is more, there's acute demand and movement around climate migration. Here is a scenario that, well, we need to assist the folks who remain. And then, of course, the status quo when it comes to, in this case, again, that was sort of based on the Great Lakes, older industrial city, legacy city model. And then, oh, hey, like this is going to be the best location. We're going to have prosperity. We're going to be able to handle all this. So, we'll just say the optimist scenario versus on the opposite side. And then, of course, thinking, oh, well, maybe the climate impacts might be moderate versus severe. Here's population decline, population growth. So you take these variables, and certainly you, in a scenario planning workshop, you might have 2 or 3 of these, because you might have different pairs of variables, right? For the Great Lakes cities, the population growth versus population decline is just inherent in the DNA, given their experience over the last 50 to 70 years. And one of the issues that we discussed in Cleveland was Cleveland is still losing population, which means there's a lot of vacancy and abandonment and declining homes. So is that an opportunity, or if people don't come to Cleveland, is it just the status quo dealing with issues of decline and poverty? So this was, again, we'll make sure that you get links to this, but this is the report that was really the summary of our Cleveland workshop, but it's a great title, Anticipated but Unpredictable. My colleague Terry Schwartz, who directs the Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative, was going to join us today, but unfortunately could not do that. So, for those of you who want to next week start your first scenario planning workshop, give me a call. I'm happy to help you know. Some core steps. I mean, this isn't dramatically different from the types of, I'll just say, community engagement that you're talking about, or that you've done in the past. But, you identify who you want in the room, you set your goals, you determine the central themes, in this case, sort of your axis, with data. And I would say, when I'm saying data, it's not just numbers, but it's maps, GIS, because you've got to try to visualize these uncertainties. You pinpoint what the driving forces of change are: population, decline, growth. Is it rapid? Is it slow? And then you develop these alternatives so that the folks participating, can understand. Because when you looked at that graph and the different variables, depending on how your mind works, are you a visual learner? Are you, you're comfortable with numbers? That might be a little confusing. So, you want to develop those scenarios, and then part of your discussion with the group is to outline the strategies that you would need in order to respond to the scenario. So, if we were together to say, okay, we're going to do a climate migration, climate mobility scenario planning exercise, we would kind of go through these scenarios and then try to identify what kinds of actions would we need to take in order to respond to each of those scenarios. So I'm going to kind of quickly go through what we did in Cleveland. So just first, a little background, who was involved. Again, here was sort of our core group. Mike Foley was really our point person in Cleveland. with his team at the Department of Sustainability. I would also say, which I think many of you have raised or that we've heard, is when we're talking about climate mobility or climate migration, we immediately gravitate, oh, it's like, city to city. And we recognize that it's really going to be region to region, and that there may be migration even within a region. I mean, that's sort of what we're seeing, not because of climate, but when we see, we'll just say, disaster migration. Katrina is a great example. Some of the researchers at the Urban Institute did a lot of research and found out, people went as far away as Houston, but, they may have gone closer, like to Baton Rouge or, to Tallahassee. So people don't go far. We had a small group. We had about 30 folks, but again, we had folks from different cities, from local government at the county. We had nonprofits, Water Alliance, the Land Bank, Cleveland Foundation, local businesses. We had the sewer and the energy folks there. It was kind of fun. It was a good group. Of course, you've heard all about the climate haven narrative that we really have to move past. But part of the introduction to set the stage was looking at not just the winners and losers across the country, but we also had an opportunity to look at the data of population change in Cleveland. And then, of course, looking at, the climate challenges for the Great Lakes. That even with the Great Lakes, there's going to be extremes in weather, right? You're going to have drought, and you're going to have floods. You're going to have, hotter temperatures and then colder temperatures. Okay, so what did we do? So for this particular group, we focused, just given our backgrounds, on the impacts and the policies to the built environment. Certainly, there's a host of issues related to education, related to health services, related to shelter. So we did touch upon those, but for the folks who were invited, it was more thinking about policies and programs related to, again, land use, environmental protection, infrastructure, and the idea was to come through as we discuss these alternatives, what kind of potential actions could local governments take now to prepare? So kind of getting them to think under each of these scenarios, what would they need to do? So, very similar exercise that you saw the stickies, population growth on the regional scale, population decline, and then it was looking at the development pattern. Like, where will people go in Cuyahoga County and beyond? Will they just continue to sprawl? Will they be the status quo, which is their, not the status quo, but they would be able to sort of thrive without growth? Would they be able to reuse as population goes up, vacant and land and existing infrastructure? Or on the periphery, there would be, sort of net zero. There wouldn't be a lot of change. So, again, these are the 4 scenarios. Regional population growth, but most of it just going out. Regional population is declining. Scenario 2, which is really more the status quo. Scenario 3, it's concentrated within the existing municipalities, which from a sustainability perspective might be the best scenario. And here there is some infill development, but the population's continuing to decline. So we did breakouts, and people went through these different scenarios. And again, they had certain teams that then looked at, these 4 these 4 impacts: population change, climate change, development, and then community and economic development impacts. And they played with sticky notes. wouldn't you guys have loved to play with sticky notes today? I mean, just to get up and put your ideas on a board. So again, this was at a school of urban design. So you have like, sort of different spaces that help facilitate that kind of exercise and interaction. But then as people put out their ideas like, well, we would need to do this in order to respond to this particular scenario. One of the things that became apparent is that, look, in order to do this in a more equitable way, as you guys alluded to earlier, it's one thing to be able to do it, I will just say, from a logistical or engineering perspective. Okay, I'm kind of thinking of the days when I worked at ICMA, the International City County Managers Association, and we helped facilitate some working groups between the Department of Defense and city and county managers on base closure. And so it was really like dealing with the military. It's all about, we've got this much property, we're moving this, this is what you can take. It was very, like the military. You'd like take territory, we're ceding territory. Like moving people was like moving, tanks and implements of war. But that doesn't apply when we're talking about community. And one of the interesting insights, which I'll also reinforce, is I would say if there was one inescapable conclusion that this group had in Cleveland in terms of what kind of action can we take now, that inescapable conclusion was we need to take care of our own house first, which is we already have neighborhoods that have lots of vacant and available land that new people coming from outside this region, if climate migration all of a sudden accelerated, we could house them there, but then we'll still have issues of inequality, of poverty, of inequities, health disparities with our existing population. They will even get more pushed out, or they will even get more, mistreatment than what they have now. So if there was one thing we could do now, is let's address these inequalities now so that if or when new people come in, our community will be more equitable, and so we'll be in a better position to receive if we have, that kind of more of a stable community.
So, Joe,
Mm-hmm.
was that introduced as almost a fail-safe way of operating? We don't know that Cleveland would necessarily be a receiving community, but this is a good thing to do regardless of receiving or not receiving. Because I think about how reluctant people are to engage in hard things when the outcome is uncertain. And so if you were able to say, our motive is to be prepared in the future, but either way, this is a good thing. Does that motivate people? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair insight to, how people approached it, right? And it wasn't, we'll just say, it wasn't like there was an aha moment. It sort of built momentum, as I'll list a few of the more specific policies, but it was like, oh, well, we need to do that anyway. Like someone said, I forget, something like, we need to take care of our own house first before we invite people in. I think Mike Foley, the sustainability director, sort of framed it that way. And yeah, but I think you're right. It was like, well, yeah, if we all of a sudden say, create a community land trust and we're going to take all this vacant land and we're going to control it, waiting for the day, right, when climate migrants are going to come, that seems so speculative. But maybe we take a smaller chunk of land, we have community land trust, and we use that to have, more affordable housing, or we use it for urban gardening to deal with food insecurity. We can address those problems. Okay, you see more. So what did we find? So,
I have a question.
oh, sure, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask the conundrum often in climate scenario planning is the planning for the worst case versus robust decision making. So you plan for what do you imagine the most extreme is. So you build you know, the super duper Cadillac strong thing, spend a lot of money, or you sort of split the difference and find what's the sort of optimal cost and robustness that allows you to survive a different scenario, different flexibilities. Was there any conceptualization?
A little
in
bit of
this?
that. Yeah, a little bit of that. I think that's one of the challenges in that, you know, we were there for basically 5 hours. Okay. And what I would say is with this particular process, you need to really have it continue. Like if someone came to me and said, okay, not saying that money is the option, but what would you do? I would say you would get this group together, you would start expanding the group, and you would do this over a process of like 6 to 9 months, right? Because you want to then spend like a whole day on the worst case scenario. One, just so it scares everyone. No, right? It scares everyone, but you know, so that you really do grapple with that, and then as Jennifer was alluding, once you deal with sort of the worst case scenario, it makes some of the other options more realistic. So, you know, again, for those of you who work in urban planning, deal with land use and infrastructure, there's nothing too, I mean, out there, right? It's like, oh, let's cap the watershed stewardship center. Let's do small scale urban greening. Let's expand businesses. I mean, these are existing policies that you would need to calibrate, right, to a new groups coming in. And that was also another, I'd say, interesting thing is in order to actually apply these strategies, you need to understand who would be the folks coming in. And one of the things we identified, but we didn't have time to do, was to identify personas. So those of you sort of familiar with human-centered design, and you start to deal with, you know, let's come up with 5 personas of, you know, the families that might be coming in terms of not so much where they're coming in, but, you know, what kinds of issues and challenges they might have. Okay, so in conclusion, scenario planning, it worked. I mean, it was a very healthy and productive conversation, but as I mentioned, you need multiple engagements over time. You need to expand the tent, and you need to acknowledge the uncertainty. We've already mentioned data mapping, GIS analysis. I mean, it's really critical in order to visualize the alternatives. You know, what was interesting on the research, which I think was also mentioned by one of the keynote speakers, is, you know, we still don't know what the pace of climate mobility will be. And so, you know, that's one of the great uncertainties, but how can you track trends? And they were developing a model at, I can't remember if, I think it was Cleveland State, not Case Western, where they were trying to track business relocations into that area. And it's sort of an indicator species. If they started seeing, and maybe it's not going to be as dramatic as Micron going to Syracuse, but it could be, you know, plants or industries that might be coming from, you know, Kentucky or Indiana, or, you know, ones from that are more landlocked that are getting closer to water because they're concerned about water supply. And then you've all alluded to these things: contingency planning, adaptive management. But I would say, again, I've got it bolded in green, that there's this pivotal role of what I call green intermediaries. Now, in some cases, that could be a regional foundation, like the Cleveland or Gun Foundation. It could be a nonprofit, like the Water Alliance. It could be a university. And it's not to say that local government or state or federal government don't play a role, but I think they have the flexibility in terms of convening people around scenario planning, and maybe even helping put this at the community level. So as you, again, think about how you might use this, you might use this, you know, as strategic planning for an enterprise, an organization. But this is also designed to, like if you were going out into a community, you were going to, I don't know, Anacostia, you know, you were going to Mount Airy, you were going somewhere where, okay, we've got some climate challenges here. We now need to talk to people and get them to start to understand the conversation as well as the language.
And there's also really a need to make sure that sort of all the sectors, if you will, are represented, you know, including the private sector and also military.
Yes, there's the one thing is that the military have been thinking about climate change for a lot longer than most people. They may not call it that, and they're thinking about climate change not just around their installations, but they're thinking about it globally. So yes, so again, these were the questions for us to pose. I know we need to sort of wrap up and pivot to our next section. But as you reflect on the conversation, happy to hear what you think you or your organization might do with scenario planning or a community. Like, how could we really use this as a way to really jumpstart these necessary but still difficult conversations? So anyway, thank you much.
Can I share a couple things?
Sure.
Sorry. So one of the things I want to say is that in general, it's great to proceed, if you will, with scenario planning with a level of capacity building amongst those people that will be attending. And that is often skipped. And so the outcomes are not, sometimes the process gets dragged backwards, and the outcomes are not optimal. And so, making sure that you spend time preparing those that are going to participate and having sessions so that they can actually process, right? Becomes really, really, like, very, very critical. On the private sector side, also, I forgot to mention, I'm also Director Emeritus of RISE US, which is associated with the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction. And so, on the private sector side, I think there's a great opportunity to use the businesses, especially the largest businesses in a community when you're about to do scenario planning, to bring that learning, if you will, to their employees and educate their employees, because that then filters down through their families and their friends and into the community.
Yeah, it was interesting in that I think that's one of the challenges, and again, just using our Cleveland case study, was literally a month before our session, there had been a session at the University Club in Cleveland, which is, we'll just say it's, the usual Chamber of Commerce, industry folks, and, the somewhat newly elected county executive, Chris Renane, and part of his, speech was, we've got water, we're a climate haven, come here. We're sort of like, that's not the message you want. So, so I think even part of it is trying to get in the conversations with them. We did try to mention to the person who sort of manages the university club, like, oh, would you guys want a session on, climate migration? And they were like, no, that's not going to work here. Now, that may change, right? But no, you raise a good point. But I think, it's still trying to, I don't know if it's pull people, drag people, or maybe there's more subversive. We got to sort of, do some.
Inform, right? If we can start to inform, especially through, like, Cleveland Clinic, and
Cleveland
many of the other large organizations that populate these areas, down and be able to offer to them, just as we've done with